Actually, the leap of faith, to give it the memorable name that Soren Kierkegaard bestowed upon it, is an imposture. As he himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. This effort is actually too much for the human mind and leads to delusions and manias. Religion understands perfectly well that the leap is subject to sharply diminishing returns, which is why it often doesn't in fact rely on faith at all, but instead corrupts faith and insults reason.
You are listening to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates science, secular humanism, and the courage it takes to embrace an evidence-based life of doubt and questioning. Hello and welcome to episode number 2 of A Leap of Doubt, my baby podcast, which I hope will have a long and happy life in the secular, skeptical, atheist podsphere. I'm your host, Nathan Dickey. I titled this podcast A Leap of Doubt, not just because I'm trying to be clever with a twist on the famous leap of faith phrase and concept popularized by Soren Kierkegaard, but also because I love the process of doubting, of questioning one's own dearly held beliefs and worldview, and the courage and honesty that process requires of each person who thinks seriously about hard questions and applies them to their day-to-day life. I have a special fascination with deconversion stories because, among other reasons, it's a journey I myself took. Joining me for this second episode is Jenica and Patrick Crail, a formerly Christian, now atheist couple, who took the hard journey of deconversion from faith together as a married couple. I am really excited to talk to both of you about your journey because your deconversion is somewhat unique in that you underwent the loss of faith together and came out the other side even stronger in your commitment to each other. So thank you for joining me, Jenica and Patrick Crail.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
Both of you came from similar backgrounds, both from church backgrounds, but different church backgrounds. I guess we'll start with the differences in those church backgrounds. They were both Christian, but one was more of a conservative upbringing, and one was more charismatic-leaning one.
Yeah, mine was the more conservative background, pretty mainstream kind of Christian church. Nothing too exciting there, but Jenica's a little
conservative
more
as far as like charismatic goes. Like I think mine, as far as like theology and stuff, was more conservative, but we were also more wacky.
Yeah, conservative in the sense of you're not as expressive in your emotions and like worshipful sentiments and the way you express worship, essentially.
I didn't have much to say since yours is a little bit more interesting. Mine is very like mainstream. Go to church, you say hi to your friends, hang out a little bit, get some coffee and donuts, and then you go home.
Lucky me, mine is more interesting. So like mine was bordering on Pentecostal, like kind of like leaning that way, but not all the way there. Like we weren't handling snakes yet.
And no drinking poison or anything like that?
No, we didn't get into drinking poison. That's why we're all still around. But
there's a verse, I think, in Mark. It's the same verse that the snake handling passage is in that talks about drinking poisonous substances and not dying. And there are some Christian sects out there that actually practice that.
Yeah, which is just amazing. I don't understand. I just don't understand. I mean, I should, because I've been there. Like I've been in that place where you just believe everything that you're told. But drinking poison, I feel like, was just like stepping just a touch beyond.
Yeah, it's not usually ignorance. A good idea.
Yeah,
not usually. Yeah, you build up an immunity to it, but they don't believe that's the reason that they survive.
Oh, yeah. It can't be a scientific reason.
Yeah, so similar religious background, but different church settings.
Right.
And,
Patrick's was more like a community, and mine was like, I'm a worship dancer, and I speak in tongues.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one thing that I found really interesting, listening through your podcast And I can't believe I didn't mention it already. Real Life Beyond Faith, which it's a really great podcast because it just it just laid out your whole story episode by episode, at least for the first 6 or 7. And we're going to kind of try to recapitulate the story you told in the space of about an hour, whereas in your podcast you have about 5 or 6 hours worth of you just telling your story. So I really recommend listening through the first several episodes if you want to get the full picture. Jenica, your background is very similar to mine in that you were homeschooled, you were raised in an evangelical Christian church, and I was also homeschooled and raised in a similar environment. Did you feel like that changed kind of the way you approached faith versus you, Patrick, going to public school and kind of being immersed in the world of learning how to socialize with people outside your tradition? Is your experience kind of similar to mine as someone who was also homeschooled, where you're kind of isolated and that kind of makes your worldview more embedded and harder to break out of, versus someone like you, Patrick, who was like outside the world in a sense and also in the world of the church, kind of a foot in both worlds?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I definitely took my faith more seriously. And I think because I was so kind of sheltered, because like really my whole world was at home with my family, who were all deep believers, except for my brother, but I didn't know that at the time. And then my church world. So really, like, everyone I knew believed the same things and lived out their Christianity in the exact same way. So it just kind of like hammered it into my head that this is the truth and there is no other truth, and the rest of the world is dying and we need to go out there and save them. So that was my whole childhood, early, teen years. And then I did actually go to high school, to a public school of 2,000 students. So huge culture shock. But it's kind of interesting though, because even though I had it ingrained in me so much more strongly than Patrick did, I don't know if it's my personality or what, but once I started digging into things and started realizing that the stuff I had believed wasn't true, I was able to shed it so fast. I shed that shit like nobody's business. So I don't know, like, I think it might just be the way I am. Like, I'm able to quickly like change my mindset about a thing. But I think it was definitely interesting to start learning how the rest of the world actually was. And when I started like meeting gay people when I was working at a restaurant, like, they're not evil. And it turns out I don't think they actually choose this, because why would you choose something that, makes your life more difficult?
Exactly.
Like, they don't enjoy being, treated poorly in society. So why the fuck would they choose that?
I was a little bit more exposed growing up to both sides, and I'm wondering how
Christian
that
world and non-Christian world, you mean?
Yeah, and I'm wondering how that had a play in like my deconversion, because I was more kind of like middle of the road, like growing up, if that made me a little more
balanced.
Yeah.
Healthy.
And I wonder if you're more, I wouldn't even say extreme, but like you're
more charismatic.
Yeah, if that contributed to like being able to drop it so quickly, where me, it was more kind of normal to see both sides of things.
Yeah.
I don't know.
If you're used to seeing both sides of things and used to living in both worlds, like being in quote unquote the world and also in the church, you kind of become accustomed to kind of holding both a secular and a religious mindset at the same time, but also kind of superimposing your religion on the outside world. And because you're more accustomed to life outside the church, the different dynamics involved in the ease with which, or the difficulty with which you both found questioning your faith was, where if you kind of live in both worlds, kind of have a secular experience, you actually, I think, become more accustomed to living with kind of both worlds in your head. The insulated world and the world outside. And so it might be harder to question your faith because you're used to living with both worlds in your head. Whereas if you experience culture shock, then it becomes more natural to you to question the picture you were presented with, which was kind of in isolation from everything else outside. So that's where I see the difference in how hard or easy it is to deconvert, is how much of a culture shock you have versus how accustomed you are to being used to the secular world and the religious world at the same time.
Yeah, it seems like liberal believers tend to have a harder time letting go of it because they don't really have solid theology or solid doctrine that they hold on to, all or nothing. Like for me, the Bible is true, all or nothing, you know, like I wasn't the type of Christian to pick out, gay people are fine, they're not sinners. That was just in the Old Testament. Nobody cares about that anymore. Like for me, it was all the inspired word of God. And so when I started questioning little bits, I had to question the whole. So that makes total sense.
So you talk about in your podcast, the early episodes, that you go to public school around 9th grade, I believe, right?
Yeah, I did.
And you have this realization that most of the people you encounter in public school are actually already Christian, at least nominally, or that everybody has heard about Christianity. And I had the same kind of experience being homeschooled all the way through until graduation, where I was taught that just people don't really know about Christianity or true Christianity, and that they just don't care, and that you have to go out and evangelize and tell people about these things.
I was taught that I would have to tell people about Jesus. And then I go out there and I'm trying to tell people about Jesus. They're like, where do you think I live?
Right.
I'm like, well, do you know that he died on a cross and saved you? Yeah, honey.
Why am I being homeschooled?
Well, that was once I was in school and I'm trying to have these conversations and evangelize. And I'm like, well, shit. Everyone already knows about Jesus. I'm not doing anything to help.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, if you know about him, why haven't you accepted him?
Yeah.
This is bullshit.
Yeah.
No, it's
yeah,
not.
I went through the same thing of the church teaching me that there's this concept or this theme that was kind of recurring that they always brought up. The world, the flesh, and the devil. There was a church, and then everything else was the world, the flesh, and the devil. And that trifecta kind of defined everything that was outside of Christianity. And it was framed as a war, a spiritual warfare between the children of God and the children of Satan. I kind of quickly realized that the world was that's not how the world works as soon as I left home. But, so what made you first start doubting and asking the hard questions? And you can kind of both talk about that in turn.
Well, since I started kind of doubting first, I'll go first.
Yeah.
So I would say the first doubts that entered my mind were probably serious doubts. Were probably when I found out that my brother was an atheist. He came out when he was 16 to my family as an atheist, mainly to my parents. And then, of course, my parents told the rest of us, and we were all devastated. I was 20 at the time because he's 4 years younger than I am. And it wrecked me because he's such a good person. I couldn't comprehend that such a wonderful person didn't believe in God, because I had been taught that you're only good with God. Anyone who doesn't believe in God is obviously going to be immoral, and they're not going to care about, honesty and integrity. They're just turning away from God so they can have sex with whoever they want and stuff. That kind of threw me for a loop. And over the next I think it was 7 years, I just kind of like bounced around. Like I would be like really strong in my faith for a while, and then questions would pop up in my head, and I would just get like really, bogged down with these doubts that I had about original sin. Like, why are we born with this? Why is it something that we didn't choose? Like, I didn't choose to be a sinner, and yet I'm being held responsible for it. And so it was like that kind of stuff just kind of like eating away at my faith, until finally, when my dad came out as an atheist, is when like the doubts really spiked. And I decided to look into these things for myself, to, hear from the atheist side. What do they have to say about it? And what could possibly change my dad's mind after being a Christian for his entire life, and like being my spiritual leader, really, and the person who, has encouraged me in my faith throughout my whole life. Like, this person found something that convinced him it was all bullshit, and I need to know what that is. And so that's where my deconversion started. Patrick, your turn.
And that's where mine started as well. When your dad came out to the family as an atheist, it kind of like shook what I thought I knew in my beliefs. And like, I actually went into the research trying to strengthen my faith, because with him being an atheist, it kind of like made things unsettled. So I was trying to strengthen my faith to try to steer away from it. Well, that didn't work out. So we started going through research, reading books, watching debates between atheists and Christians, and the more research I did, the more it just fell apart. And, it took me longer to go through the process than Jenica.
Because I'm a spaz.
Yeah.
Like, when it comes to, like, researching a topic, I am obsessive, and I'm a spaz, so. That's probably why.
But yeah, it's amazing. Like, the more you research, even just trying to strengthen your faith, like, the more it just falls apart, because they don't teach you all the stuff in church, all the stuff that you should know.
Like, stuff that biblical scholars almost entirely agree on.
Yeah.
Like, about perjuries in the Bible.
And we had no idea.
Yeah. Like, never even mentioned. They talk about all the stories in the Bible as if they actually happened.
Yeah, I had kind of the same experience. I actually started, after high school, I started training to become a professional apologist, and I went to like training seminars and conferences for apologetics to learn kind of the tools of the trade of defending your faith. And
that go?
Yeah, I'm not sure how many of the other people who were going through that same process with me of being trained to be apologists took the approach I did, which seemed natural to me, which was, hey, I should like read up on the opposition and see what they're saying, and read about atheism and evolution and kind of the history of the Bible and all these things that touch on what I'm trying to defend. And so I did that research, and I was like, holy shit, they're making so much more sense than the apologists. They're actually answering the hard questions and not dodging around them and not like rationalizing them away. And so yeah, I went through something very similar of seeing the difference between the way apologists and their more secular interlocutors were approaching these questions, and the difference in honesty and integrity that went into that. And one thing that really interested me listening through your podcast was that, well, to back up a little bit, you two met in college, and Jenica, you took Patrick to your parents' church.
Yeah. Well, my parents weren't going there at the time. They had moved on to a more normal church. But yeah.
So you and Patrick kind of switched to, and your parents as well, to more of the kind of church that was more in line with what you, Patrick, were used to. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to the newer church, and I'm like, this is more like it. Like, I can handle this.
Well, the thing is, like, the church that I first took him to was a smaller church, very charismatic. It was all of the people that I had grown up with. I had like very strong relationships with those people. And so it felt like a home to me, even though I was starting to kind of grow out of that kind of charismatic religion. I still just like, I just dealt with the weirdness and the dancing around and being silly.
But then for me, on my first day there, they're like, hey, new person, fresh meat. They did some songs, and then they were like, hey, if you're new, if you're a visitor, stand up so everyone can see you.
And clap for you and make you feel really awkward and give you a free book.
Yeah.
It was so weird. I don't know. They're just so awkward that they didn't know how to make someone actually feel welcome. It was more like, here, let's embarrass the crap out of you.
Yeah.
So I think Patrick was kind of turned off by that, but I mean, he liked me enough to stick it out. And we went there for several weeks. And then one week, like literally in the middle of the service, we just got up and left and went to my parents' church.
Yeah. We were like, if we leave now, we could still make it. Do you want to go?
Yeah. So we showed up at the other church, got ourselves a cup of coffee in the nice little cafe they had.
Yeah.
And went into worship. But yeah, I'm so glad that you liked me enough to put up with that for a little bit. And the thing is, I still love the people from that church. I still care very deeply for all of them.
What interested me is that kind of the same, or this is my impression listening through your podcast, was that the same developments that you both went through together in an attempt to strengthen your faith. Like, for example, trying out different churches to see what fit, actually set in motion the thought processes that led both of you down the road to doubting. Like Jenica, you talk about going to a weekday Bible study, and instead of, hearing about all this inspirational stuff from the New Testament, you were going through Deuteronomy and being exposed to the fact that the Bible promotes slavery. And is this kind of what prompted you to read atheist books, along with the fact that some of your family members were going down the atheist route?
Yeah, I think so, because I was actually in that Bible study around the exact same time that my dad came out as atheist. Like, that was kind of why I wanted to do the Bible study, because I'm like, okay, I'm about to dive into all this research. I need to make sure that I am, like, in the Word. Like, people who are Christian may know that expression better than others, but like I needed to be like immersed in the Word, and it backfired hardcore, super hardcore.
Yeah, if you're gonna look into the Bible to try to strengthen your faith, Deuteronomy is probably not the best option.
Yeah.
Did they try to explain the slavery away somehow, or like do apologetics about it and kind of try to soften it up?
Exactly. Yeah, it was good though, because I mean, good for my deconversion, better for helping me like get rid of these, beliefs that I had, because like when you're reading Deuteronomy, you're kind of exposing yourself to the real side of the Bible that you don't often pay attention to. And so that really helped me to kind of let go of the fact that the Bible is the inerrant word of God. It's clearly not inerrant. So yeah, it was definitely a step along the process, I would say.
Yeah.
Kind of helping me free myself.
First little push.
Yeah.
Jenica, you turned atheist before Patrick did. What kind of effect did that have on your marriage? And what was like the conversation like? What tensions arose? How did you like find a way through it to stay together, essentially?
Well, he wasn't super thrilled about wanting to eat babies now. That was a conversation we had to have, and he just had to accept it. So, no, but in seriousness, it was difficult at first. A lot of it we were kind of like learning together. Like I would read a book and I'd be like, "Holy crap, Patrick, did you know?" And he'd be like, oh, wow, like, are you sure? Like, he asked a lot of questions like, well, how can you be sure that they're right and the Christians are wrong? I'm like, well, you just have to read the book. Just, you need to do the research yourself. And I kept encouraging him to read the books I was reading and to look into it for himself. And so he did. He wasn't able to do as much of the research right away as I was, because I was at home a lot more with the boys and stuff. And I was working at night, bartending, or not bartending at the time. I was serving at the time, but at a bar. Anyway, I kind of dug into it, and I was telling him things throughout my process, and most of the time it just led to really intense conversations about it, and other times it was really kind of hard because I was upset, I was angry, and I felt betrayed, and, you know, my whole worldview was falling apart, and I wanted somebody to be angry at, and I had no one to be angry at. And so I either had to internalize it and just squash it, or I could lash out at somebody. And after several glasses of wine, it's easy to turn to the person that you live with and lash out at them. So that happened a couple of times, and it's one of my biggest regrets. But we did learn a lot about each other and about ourselves during that time. And I think that through that process and through going through the hardest part of our lives together and coming out the other end made us a whole lot stronger than anything else could have. Like, if we would have had just easy roads all along our marriage with no strife, I think our marriage would not be quite as strong as it is now. So I'm glad that we went through it. It sucked in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it also built us up and has made our relationship, I think, stronger than it ever could have been otherwise.
Yeah, I agree.
Some people talk about the stages of deconversion in the same way they talk about the stages of grief or mourning, of losing something that they had held dear and held tightly onto their whole life. Did you go through similar stages as grief and mourning in regards to deconversion, or was it more like it was hard at first, but then you realized how freeing and liberating it is, and it was easy to forget those steps?
Yeah, the stages for me coming out of religion were very similar to the stages of grief. You know, denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. But I think it was more so for me than Patrick, because he went through his process so much slower that he kind of experienced those things through me experiencing them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I skipped the denial part, but went straight into anger. And I think that was the most intense stage for me, was the anger. I'm now in the acceptance stage, like hardcore, because I don't miss it at all. I'm fine. I'm not super angry, although I do keep a little bit of anger because I'm an activist and you have to be angry to be an activist.
Do you feel like your atheist activism has the same characteristics as your Christian activism back when you were a Christian? Because I hear this a lot from Christian apologists and even just lay people in general who are still believers. They say, oh, you're just like you were when you were a Christian, only you're vocal and strident about atheism now. Do you feel like you're the same kind of activist, only with a different belief? Or is there something like different about everything you approach, all the ways you approach life and approach discussions with people and so on?
At least for me, I think it's a little bit of both, because with activism in the church or through religion, that's not the only thing that's driving you. It's who you are as a person and your personality. And when you leave religion, like, you are still that person, but with different beliefs. So it can be easy to go back to the same kind of activism with something else, because that's how you're comfortable as a person. At the same time, it's like, you don't want to just replace one thing with another. And knowing things a little bit better, like going through the process, you can do things in a better way instead of just kind of like following along.
Well, for me, I think my activism now is a little bit different than it was before. Before, yes, I was passionate. I wanted to evangelize. I wanted to, get the word out to the world so that I could, save as many people as I could from damnation. But now it's like, I don't have the cognitive dissonance holding me back. Because back then, I would have a conversation with someone about faith, and all of their questions were so difficult to answer because there was all this cognitive dissonance where I wanted to agree with them. Like, yeah, you're right. But at the same time, like, I can't do that if I'm trying to, win them for Christ. I had to try to make excuses and come up with answers, even though I didn't have answers to these questions because they're questions I'm asking too.
And that's what I was trying to get at too, is things make more sense now.
Yeah.
So it's easier to be more effective.
Yeah. So now I don't have cognitive dissonance. I have evidence. I have statistics behind the things that I am passionate about. And I can go out there and I can say with confidence that, yes, this needs to change, and this is harmful to people. And I can, have total confidence in that. So it makes me a more passionate, stronger activist, and it encourages me to be more active. So yeah, I'm a much more annoying activist now than I was when I was a Christian.
Yeah, the difference I would say is that for Christian activists, the best tool they have is their emotion and their passion. They don't really have the kind of logic and reasoning and evidence behind that passion, whereas people like us, well, more like you, because I'm not as involved as I'd like to be with atheist activism, but for atheist activists and secular activists, you can hold on to the same passion and emotion that makes you who you are, and that connects you to who you've been in the past, but also you have this additional element of reason and logic and evidence backing you up and kind of complementing your emotional delivery of these things that you want to reach people with.
Yeah, we have information on our side now. So if someone comes and challenges us, we are able to share that information as opposed to like getting stuck in a corner and being like, I don't know, it feels right to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of following up on that, what other beliefs or aspects of your worldview were altered or modified as a result of becoming atheists? Because I hear this a lot, kind of similar to what I was just talking about. You're just like us Christians, only you're atheists now, and we're just talking past each other. Whereas I hear a lot from people like you and other people who have deconverted that changing your perspective or your belief about God changes all sorts of other things that are tangential to that.
It changed pretty much everything, I think.
I think
like our basic morality obviously is still there, but it has morphed into something more concrete and reasonable. It's not based on an old book. It's based on, creating the least harm. Like when it comes to sexuality, we base it on consent, and are the people adults, and is there deception involved? We're basing it on that instead of like, oh, well, the Bible says don't have sex before marriage, which I don't even think it says. I think
we've just become a lot more accepting of people. Like, it's been so freeing to not have to discriminate and be so judgmental of everybody.
Yeah, it's so ironic that the Bible in the New Testament talks about not judging people, but then gives you all of the reasons to judge. Like you can't just accept gay people or trans people or anything because they're other human beings and they're worthy of acceptance. You have to try to filter it through your mind that's just like bogged down with all of these stupid beliefs. Man is a man and a woman is a woman. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. No. They're other human beings, and now we have the opportunity to step back and listen to somebody else's experience and be able to accept them and love them completely just for who they are. And God, that's so freeing.
Yep. I agree. Did you experience any challenges in finding a community of fellow non-believers as atheists living in a new city because you moved to Cincinnati kind of during this process?
At first it took a little bit of time because we weren't exactly trying to plug ourselves in. But once we did find something, like we started scrubbing through this app Meetup, trying to find things that we could get connected with, and we found the Tri-State Freethinkers through that. And once we started getting to that, that's where we really felt connected and started getting involved through them.
Yeah, and I was getting more involved with people online, I guess, like through social media, things like that. I think that's the route a lot of atheists take, is like, how can I find my people?
Right.
Well,
yeah, even if they're not
the
local.
internet is full of people who agree with you. You just have to find them. And my main way of finding people was through podcasts. I would listen to podcasts. I would hear, someone talking about a subject. I'd listen to what their name was, and I'd find them online, and I would friend them or, start up a conversation. And really, that was a lifesaver for me because I felt more connected and a lot less isolated. There were still like feelings of being isolated and not having a community anymore. But that quickly changed as I realized that there were so many wonderful, wonderful people in the secular movement and that I could get involved with that. And I started a blog. Part of the reason I started the blog, like I wasn't even that active on it, but part of the reason I started it is because I wanted to be involved in this movement in whatever way I could find. And it kind of gave me an excuse to like reach out to people and be like, hey, I have a blog.
Yep, that's very similar to my story as well. I started blogging soon after I deconverted it was almost 7 or 8 years ago now. I think the community aspect is really important because I think the main function of churches is community, but they don't admit that. The reason people stay ensconced in their religious environments, even if they're having doubts, is because the religious environments and the churches convince them that this is the only community they'll find, and that people who don't accept their worldview are kind of outsiders without a community. That's kind of the picture they want people to accept, and even without saying it explicitly, that you have community here and that's what church is for and that's why you should stay. And I think that's why a lot of people do stay even after experiencing doubts and asking hard questions and such.
Yeah, that is one thing that church does really well, is community.
Yeah. And having activities and events for all age levels.
Yeah.
That's nice. But the thing is they also have more people and it's hard to do all of those things without more people involved. And so I think that, the secular atheist movement is getting better at that. Like I'm even seeing it happen in the Tri-State Freethinkers. I'm a board member now, and I was brought on to be the family event coordinator. So
awesome.
Definitely getting better at that in some of our groups around the country.
Which will be huge because that was one of the obstacles for us having 2 young children, is not being able to get too involved in stuff if we don't have childcare. So that'll, not only for us, but a lot of people like us who have children, it'll help them be able to get more involved. So
we did have one question from, a future listener, because I haven't released any episodes yet. But this question actually comes from my co-host, Cal, who co-hosts my other podcast, Trolling with Logic. He asks, how did your in-laws react to your deconversion? And he goes on to say, I have heard that parents will tend to blame their child's spouse for their child changing religion. Did you experience this?
I don't know. I mean, they haven't said that they blame me. It's definitely a fear. They took it pretty well when we told them the first time. And by pretty well, I mean, they were obviously disappointed, asked a lot of questions, tried to do a little bit of apologetics. But, my answers were solid. So that was very, I think, demoralizing for them. But they did really well in the fact that they told me that they still love me like a daughter and that this doesn't change the way they feel about me. Now, keep in mind, this is literally the only conversation we've ever had with them about it, and it was right after I had become an atheist, and Patrick,
and I was still going through
Patrick
the process.
wasn't an atheist yet. So I don't know if their minds have changed about me by now, because now I'm vocal on social media. I'm a board member for an atheist group. I have an atheist podcast with their son. So I don't know. Maybe they hate me now, but. the thing is like, we just keep it as the elephant in the room. We just don't talk about it. Like, every once in a while, I'll bring something up, or I'll talk about how I hate Trump, and and they just kind of like brush it off and don't talk about it, which is hard for me. I'd rather talk things out. I'd rather have things out on the table. And like, if you have negative feelings towards me, I want to be able to talk that out and explain where I'm coming from. But in their case, they kind of don't really do that, and that's fine. Like, I'll be sensitive to their needs and their timing, and if they want to talk to me, I'm always open. I'm an open book.
Yeah.
I love them to death. So I don't bring up like arguments or like get things stirred up, because I want to maintain that relationship with them, and they're wonderful grandparents.
Great. Well, do you have any resources, such as books or podcasts, you would recommend to somebody who is starting to go through that process of questioning their faith and doesn't know whether they should come out, whether they should take the leap, whether they should kind of be open about it to themselves and to others, and are really struggling to hold on to what they know is indefensible? What kind of resources would you recommend for them to kind of ease their transition out of religion?
Well, first of all, there's one as far as connecting with people, not necessarily information, but there's recovering from religion. There's a hotline that you can call. There's a chat that you can just chat with somebody to try to talk you through things in case you don't like talking on the phone.
Well, and even information-wise, they have a huge list of resources. Yeah. And if you talk to one of the agents, either on the chat line or like a call-in, they can point you to the resources that would help you with your specific situation. So it's a huge, helpful resource. And
has our podcast even been added to that list?
I think so. Yeah. I know that a couple of my blog articles have been added, and I'm almost positive that our podcast has too. Yeah. But it's recoveringfromreligion.org. So if you want all of the things, that's where I would point you. As far as like specific podcasts that have helped me, the very first atheist podcast I ever listened to was The Thinking Atheist.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Just because he covers such a broad variety of subjects, it helped me realize that atheists were good people, and it kind of pointed me in the direction of, caring more about social justice and caring more about like what people experience when they leave their faith and they're dealing with all of these struggles, and it helped me to get through those. And it also pointed me in the direction of other podcasts. So the second podcast I ever got into was cognitive dissonance. Mm-hmm. So I had like both ends of the spectrum. I had the serious podcast that was like talking about like the hard topics, and it was emotional and everything. And then I had the funny guys who were talking about atheism like it was no big deal. And I could sit there and I could laugh at all the stuff that I used to take super seriously. And I think that was very therapeutic as well. So to have like a nice balance where you're not just like always angry and always upset, but you can also like laugh at stuff that used to make you cry, I think huge.
Yeah, it helps to be able to laugh.
And there are a lot of atheist blogs. If you go to Patheos, I think that's how you pronounce it. Patheos, I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, Patheos Atheist. There are a ton of blogs on there and people talking about all the different, aspects of leaving religion, of being an atheist in general. So actually, I was impressed with how many resources were out there. And just 20 years ago, they didn't have these resources.
No.
So it's really cool. There are a lot of people who understand and can empathize with leaving religion and everything that comes along with that.
Yeah, and Facebook communities have been a huge part of that for us too, like finding a community that you fit into, like-minded people, local groups. It's been huge for us, like being able to talk through some things with like-minded people and actually become really good friends with them.
Yeah. And if you're looking for a blog that talks about leaving religion, you can go to reallifebeyondfaith.com.
Yeah, and I'll be putting a link to a lot of the things you mentioned, and including, of course, your podcast and your blog. I want to thank you both for coming on this second episode. Hopefully it won't be forgotten and buried under all the other podcasts I do in the future. You're welcome to come back on anytime. Also, I gotta say, Patrick, whatever Chris Watson says, your beard is a lot cooler than his.
Yes.
I first heard you guys on his podcast, the Podunk Polymath, and it seemed like he was kind of overcompensating with his talking about how bad your beard is, or he was talking about how awesome your beard is, but in a kind of passive aggressive way that you could tell he was envious about it. So
Beard Wars.
Yeah, well, thank you both for coming on and
for having us,
and for talking through these things, and for being willing to put your reputation on the line by coming on a brand new podcast.
Yeah, it's been our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to A Leap of Doubt. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. If you want to get involved in the kinds of discussions this show is meant to encourage, you can find a discussion group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/ALOP discussion. You can follow me and get in touch with me on Twitter, where my username is @thenatheist. Feedback and criticisms are always welcome. The opening clip is an excerpt from the audiobook God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, courtesy of Hachette Audio. Text copyright 2007 by Christopher Hitchens. Audio production copyright 2007 Hachette Audio. Used with permission. The music is Jade by Esther Nicholson and is used under license.
No, you should hear all the stuff that we have to edit out of ours. Like, we'll just, like, stop in the middle of a sentence, be like, yep, so, what?